When an empath suddenly goes quiet, most people assume it's just a mood. They think maybe they're overwhelmed, tired, or being dramatic. But what they fail to understand is that an empath's silence is rarely impulsive. It's rarely emotional chaos. It is a decision. Empaths are natural communicators. When something feels off, they usually address it. When they're hurt, they try to explain why. When there's tension, they seek resolution instead of distance. They believe in clarity. They believe in giving people the opportunity to understand and grow. So if that same person who once talked things through, who once over-explained their feelings just to make sure you understood, suddenly stops speaking about what's wrong, that shift means something. Silence for an empath comes after effort. It comes after they've tried to communicate gently, after they've repeated themselves in different tones, after they've given grace, patience, and the benefit of the doubt. It comes after they realize their words are being heard but not valued, that their emotions are acknowledged but not respected, and at some point, something inside them decides continuing to speak is no longer productive. That's when they go quiet. Not because they don't care, but because they care enough to stop wasting emotional energy where it's not being received. Not because they want attention, but because they've recognized that explaining themselves repeatedly feels like self-abandonment. An empath's silence is clarity forming. It's the moment they understand that love cannot survive where communication is one-sided. It's the moment they stop fighting to be understood by someone who isn't truly listening. And once they make that internal decision, their behavior shifts subtly but powerfully. They respond less, they initiate less, they stop filling the emotional gaps. To the outside world, it looks sudden, but internally it was built over time. So if an empath who once poured words into you suddenly becomes reserved, pay attention, because their silence is not confusion, it's conclusion. And by the time they stop speaking, they've already processed more than you realize. When an empath goes quiet, one of the biggest reasons is that they have been observing far longer than anyone realized. While others may assume everything is normal, the empath has been quietly paying attention to details, to tone shifts, to changes in behavior, to promises that were made but not fulfilled. They don't jump to conclusions quickly. They collect patterns. They study consistency. They watch how someone reacts under pressure, how they communicate during conflict, and how they treat them when things are going well versus when things are not. Most people think silence means ignorance, but for an empath, silence often means deep analysis. They notice the small things that others overlook, a delayed response that feels intentional, a dismissive comment disguised as a joke, a repeated excuse that replaces accountability. These moments may seem minor individually, but together they form a clear picture. And while the other person is comfortable assuming trust is automatic, the empath is quietly verifying whether that trust is still deserved. They don't confront immediately because they want to be sure. They want to understand intent before reacting. They give room for mistakes. They give room for growth, but observation without change eventually leads to realization. And when the pattern becomes undeniable, something shifts inside them. The silence that follows is not random. It is the result of processing everything they've seen over time. They've already asked the questions internally. They've already replayed conversations in their mind. They've already compared words with actions. So when they stop engaging the same way, it means their observations have reached a conclusion. What makes this powerful is that the other person often feels surprised. They say, "You never said anything." But the truth is, the empath saw everything. They just chose to observe instead of interrupt. They chose awareness over confrontation until the evidence spoke for itself. So when an empath suddenly goes quiet, it often means they have been watching long enough to understand the reality of the situation. And once understanding replaces uncertainty, their response is no longer emotional reaction. It becomes intentional distance. Another powerful reason an empath goes quiet is because they are exhausted from explaining what should already be understood. For a long time, they try to communicate clearly. They try to express how something makes them feel, why certain behaviors hurt, and what they need to feel safe in the relationship. They approach conversations with patience. They choose calm words over accusations. They repeat themselves gently, hoping that clarity will create change. But when the same concerns keep resurfacing without real effort to address them, something shifts. It starts to feel like they are not being heard, or worse, like they are being heard but ignored. And that realization drains them emotionally, because explaining once is communication. Explaining repeatedly without seeing improvement turns into emotional labor that feels pointless. Empaths don't expect perfection. They understand people make mistakes. What they struggle with is consistent disregard for what they've already expressed. When boundaries are communicated but still crossed, when feelings are shared but still minimized, When promises are made but not followed through, the empath begins to question whether further explanation will even make a difference. At that point, words lose power. They realize that continuing to articulate their pain over and over again is not creating understanding. It is creating frustration. It feels like talking into resistance. So instead of repeating themselves for the 10th time, they choose silence. That silence is not surrender. It is awareness that energy should not be wasted where effort is absent. An empath's quietness after constant explanation is often a quiet protest against emotional dismissal. They stop trying to convince someone to care about what already matters deeply to them. They stop defending their feelings as if they need approval to exist. And the most important part is this: when they stop explaining, it usually means they have accepted that the responsibility to understand no longer belongs to them alone. They have done their part. They have communicated, they have clarified, they have given opportunity after opportunity. So when they finally go quiet, it signals that they are no longer willing to overextend themselves for someone who refuses to meet them halfway. When an empath goes quiet, it often means the emotional door inside them is slowly closing. Empaths don't shut people out abruptly. They rarely wake up one day and decide to disconnect without warning. Instead, the withdrawal happens gradually. It starts with subtle changes, less enthusiasm in conversations, shorter responses, fewer attempts to initiate connection. The warmth that once flowed naturally begins to feel controlled and measured. This shift doesn't happen randomly. It happens after repeated emotional disappointment, unmet expectations, or feeling consistently drained without reciprocity. An empath can pour into a relationship for a long time, even when they are not receiving the same level of care. But over time, that imbalance accumulates. Every ignored concern, every unacknowledged effort, every moment where their feelings were minimized adds weight to their emotional load. Eventually, something inside them decides to conserve energy. When the emotional investment they once gave freely starts feeling unsafe or unappreciated, they instinctively pull back, not as punishment but as self-protection. The silence becomes a boundary. The reduced engagement becomes a signal that access to their deeper emotions is no longer automatic. What makes this phase powerful is that it often goes unnoticed at first. The other person may assume everything is normal because the empath is still physically present. They are still responding. They are still participating. But emotionally, they are stepping back one layer at a time. The connection that once felt open and intimate begins to feel distant. And by the time the change becomes obvious, the detachment has already taken root. Empaths don't announce that they are closing off. They allow the shift to happen quietly because they have already tried everything else. They communicated. They expressed hurt. They hoped for improvement. When nothing meaningful changed, withdrawal became the only option left. So when their emotional access becomes limited and their responses feel restrained, it is a sign that protection has replaced openness. The warmth may return someday, but only where safety, respect, and consistency are restored. Until then, the quiet speaks louder than words ever could. When an empath goes quiet, it is often because they are protecting their energy instead of trying to fight for understanding anymore. Over time, they realize that constant emotional engagement with certain situations or people leaves them drained, confused, or emotionally overwhelmed. They may have tried to communicate, to fix misunderstandings, to reassure, and to support, but when they see that their efforts are not leading to healthier dynamics, they shift into preservation mode. This silence is not about revenge. It is not about creating distance to punish anyone. It is about survival on an emotional level. Empaths absorb energy deeply. They feel tension in conversations. They carry other people's stress even after interactions end. When relationships become repetitive cycles of conflict, manipulation, or emotional inconsistency, their nervous system signals them to step back. At that point, talking more feels exhausting. Explaining more feels pointless. Reacting to every trigger feels like feeding a loop that never changes. So instead of continuing to engage in patterns that drain them, they withdraw. Their quiet becomes a boundary that does not require loud justification. What many people misunderstand is that this withdrawal often happens after multiple chances were given. The empath usually tolerated behavior longer than they should have. They adjusted, they compromised. They tried to see things from the other person's perspective. But once they recognize that nothing meaningful is shifting, they stop investing the same emotional intensity. And when they do that, the space they create is intentional. Protecting their energy means choosing who deserves access to their vulnerability and who no longer does. It means limiting conversations that turn into emotional arguments without resolution. It means stepping away from people who constantly take but rarely give back. The silence that follows is calm but powerful. It shows that they are no longer reacting impulsively. They are responding thoughtfully by conserving their inner strength. So when an empath suddenly becomes quiet and less available, it often signals that they have chosen peace over pressure. They have chosen stability over chaos. And most importantly, they have chosen themselves over situations that kept draining them without return. When an empath goes quiet for a deeper reason, it often means something significant has shifted inside them. It usually signals that they have reached a point of emotional saturation, a place where tolerance has turned into indifference. Empaths are patient for a long time. They give chances, they forgive mistakes, they believe in growth and change, but that patience is not endless. There comes a moment when they stop fighting for connection. That moment doesn't happen dramatically. It happens quietly after repeated patterns and repeated disappointments. They may have expressed concerns before. They may have tried to repair misunderstandings. They may have hoped that effort would be matched. But when they see consistent behavior that contradicts words, something inside them slowly shuts down, not in anger, not in hatred, but in acceptance. When an empath reaches emotional indifference, it means they have processed the pain thoroughly. They have analyzed the situation from every angle. They have replayed conversations. They have questioned themselves. And after all that reflection, they arrive at one simple conclusion: continuing to invest here no longer makes sense. That realization changes how they show up. They stop reacting emotionally to things that once triggered them. They stop seeking reassurance from someone who rarely provides stability. They stop over-explaining their feelings. The urgency to fix the relationship fades because they understand that effort only works when both sides participate. And this is what makes their silence powerful. It is no longer filled with hope or frustration. It is filled with clarity. When an empath stops caring in the way they used to, it is rarely impulsive. It is usually the final stage of repeated emotional disappointment. They didn't wake up and decide to detach overnight. They were pushed toward detachment through patterns that never changed. Once they reach that point, reversal becomes difficult. Because emotional indifference for an empath means they have already mentally and emotionally prepared to let go if necessary. They may still be kind. They may still be respectful. But the deep attachment that once kept them invested has quietly dissolved. And when that happens, the relationship often cannot return to what it was, because the empath has already moved forward internally, even if physically they are still present.